She rented a small apartment to disappear. Thin walls, a deeper voice in the dark, one accidental touch in a rain-soaked hallway, and her quiet escape turned into a fire she couldn't put out. He wasn't just the neighbor. He was the billionaire next door, and his kiss felt like destiny. But when hiding turns into surrender, what happens to the girl who swore she'd never be claimed? What would you do, run or fall? If slow-burn seduction is your oxygen, stay to the end and hit subscribe. This one only gets hotter. The key turned in her hand with a metallic sigh, and Elise pushed open the door of the small apartment she had chosen as her escape. The scent of old wood and faded sunlight drifting out to greet her, like a fragile promise of peace. And for a fleeting moment, she believed she had found the silence she craved. The floor creaked softly beneath her steps, each sound swallowed by the quiet, and she dropped her single box in the corner, feeling the weight of her past slide off her shoulders as the walls wrapped around her in anonymity. She thought this would be enough. This narrow living room, this modest kitchen, this single bedroom where she could finally sleep without eyes watching her, and she told herself that here she would vanish into simplicity. But silence is never perfect, and as dusk lowered itself outside the thin curtains, Elise became aware of sounds not her own, subtle at first, then insistent, a restless pacing, the low vibration of a man's voice, rough, masculine, muffled through the plaster, yet close enough to feel like a presence in her own room. She froze, her breath suspended, realizing she was not as alone as she had hoped, and in that realization there was a heat she had not expected, a warmth sliding into her veins that made her heart stumble. She leaned against the wall, fingers grazing the paint, feeling the faint echo of his movements on the other side, and though she should have turned away, though she should have ignored it, she found herself listening, searching the rhythm of his life for meaning. The steady tread of his feet was not careless, it was deliberate. Measured, Ammon thinking, a man carrying weight. And then came the pause, followed by the rich timbre of a sigh that seemed too heavy to belong to a stranger. A sound that sank deep into her chest and lingered there like a secret. Elise tried to laugh at herself, tried to tell her racing heart that it was only a neighbor, only the consequence of thin walls in an old building. But the truth pulsed hotter beneath the surface. She was curious, dangerously curious about the man whose presence already invaded her solitude. She closed her eyes and imagined him, tall perhaps, broad-shouldered. The kind of man whose shadow filled a doorway. The kind of man whose gaze would leave her unable to look away. The evening stretched long, the city outside whispering in distant traffic, and Elise sat in her narrow bed hugging her knees, pretending she wasn't listening for him. Yet every sound carried across the wall like a private message. She knew nothing of him. Not his name, not his face, but her body betrayed her with the flush in her skin, the breath that came too shallow, the restless need to hear him again. Solitude was what she had paid for, but temptation was what the apartment delivered. When at last silence returned, it did not comfort her as she had imagined it would. It pressed harder, sharper, like the hollow after a touch withdrawn too soon. Elise lay down, staring into the shadows, and whispered to herself that tomorrow she would not think of him. Tomorrow she would forget. But the echo of his sigh clung to her, haunting and magnetic, a promise written into the night, and as sleep finally claimed her, one question turned again and again in her restless mind, a question that set her pulse racing even in dreams. Who was the man next door? And what would happen if their worlds collided not through walls but through touch? She shouldn't want the neighbor, yet her body had already decided. The morning broke with a pale light seeping through the thin curtains, painting the walls in muted gold, and Elise stood in the kitchen with a chipped mug between her hands, telling herself the warmth of the coffee was enough to steady her restless heart. But beneath that calm surface lingered the memory of footsteps and sighs that had kept her awake. She wanted to believe she had imagined it all, that solitude would wrap itself around her again, but every beat of her pulse whispered otherwise, reminding her that just beyond a wall lived a presence she could not ignore. By afternoon, the city's drizzle had thickened into steady rain, and Elise returned from the market with a paper bag clutched against her chest, the damp air clinging to her hair, the wooden stairs creaking beneath her tired steps, her breath quick and shallow, not from the climb but from the awareness that every landing brought her closer to his door. She rehearsed in her mind what she would do if she saw him, how she would smile politely, how she would keep her eyes down. But deep inside she knew such resolve would crumble at the first brush of contact. The hallway greeted her with silence. But silence did not last because the paper bag betrayed her, its bottom tearing with a cruel rip that sent apples rolling across the worn runner. Cans clattering in a metallic chorus, and she knelt quickly, cheeks burning, fingers fumbling to gather her runaway groceries before anyone could witness her clumsy struggle. Her heart pleaded for invisibility, but fate was not kind. Behind her came the click of a lock, low and deliberate, followed by the creak of a door opening. And Elise froze, every nerve alive, knowing before she turned that it was him, the neighbor whose presence had already seeped into her nights. She forced her hands to keep moving, reaching for the last apple, though her fingers trembled, and she willed herself to finish before he stepped into the light. But then came the sound of his footsteps, slow, heavy, each one pulling her heartbeat higher into her throat. When at last she looked up, their eyes collided, and in that instant, the hallway seemed to shrink until nothing remained but the stormy grey gaze fixed on her. Sharp, unreadable, yet searing with an intensity that made the air itself feel hotter. He was taller than she had dared imagine, his shoulders broad beneath the fabric of a simple grey shirt, his presence filling the narrow space with a gravity that stole her breath. The world tilted, and Elise found herself clutching an apple to her chest, as though it were a shield against the heat rising within her. "Here," she whispered, offering the piece of fruit she had nearly dropped, her voice softer than she intended, her hand brushing his as he reached for it, and the contact, brief and electric, sent a shiver racing through her veins, leaving her fingers tingling with the imprint of his warmth. She should have pulled back quickly, but instead her hand lingered for a heartbeat too long, betraying the desire she tried desperately to conceal. His eyes caught the slip, lingered on her parted lips, and for a breathless second Elise felt the hallway disappear, felt the world hold still, as though it too were waiting to see whether the stranger next door would close the distance, whether that accidental touch would turn into something neither of them could undo. And in that unfinished moment, she realized with stunning clarity that her life of solitude had already ended, because one touch was enough to awaken everything she thought she had left behind. His fingers lingered on the apple. Would he take more than a thank you? The days that followed unfolded in a rhythm both familiar and strange. The quiet of Elise's apartment, no longer belonging solely to her, because every sound from the other side of the wall carried his presence, and she caught herself listening when she should have been working, lingering in silence just to catch the echo of his footsteps or the low murmur of his voice. She told herself it was curiosity, nothing more. Yet deep inside she knew it was the kind of curiosity that left her pulse racing, the kind that burned hotter each time. She imagined the heat of his eyes in that narrow hallway. Sometimes it was only the scrape of a chair against the floor, other times the restless pacing that stretched long into the night. And each sound seemed to draw a map of him in her mind, sketching out a man she had barely met yet could not stop imagining. She pictured him standing in his kitchen, sleeves rolled up, shoulders tense beneath the weight of thoughts she would never hear, and she wondered what kind of solitude a man like him carried. One evening, as twilight poured lavender light through her window, Elise heard the soft thrum of music seeping through the wall, not the melancholy of a radio, but the deliberate keys of a piano, low and rich, filling her small apartment with an intimacy that felt almost indecent. She sat on the floor, her back against the plaster, eyes closed, letting the melody wash through her, and every note felt like his hand brushing her skin, like a confession whispered too close to her ear. The music stopped abruptly, as though he had caught himself revealing too much. And the silence that followed was sharper than any sound. Cutting straight into her chest, Elise pressed her palm against the wall, her breath shallow, aching for the music tauten, and in that ache she realized she had crossed a line. He was no longer just a neighbor. He was the man whose silence she longed to break. Their next encounter was not planned, only the inevitability of two lives drawn together. When she stepped into the hallway with her keys and nearly collided with him returning from outside, rain clinging to his hair, his grey shirt damp against the lines of his chest. She froze, the keys slipping in her hand, and for one suspended moment the air was charged with the scent of rain and heat, his nearness overwhelming, his gaze heavy on hers. He said nothing at first, only watched her, his jaw tight as if words would cost too much, and she felt herself unraveling under the weight of that silence. She forced a polite smile, whispered a hello, but her voice trembled, betraying the storm inside her. He nodded, a gesture so small and yet so powerful, because in the flicker of his eyes, she saw the same pull she felt, the same dangerous awareness that their solitude was already broken. She stepped back to unlock her door, but the space between them seemed too narrow, their shoulders nearly brushing, and in that closeness Elise felt her breath catch, her heart stumbling wildly, because she knew the truth her body would no longer let her deny. The man next door was no longer a ghost, he was temptation made flesh, and every day would only draw her deeper into the heat she could not resist. The music stopped. Was he listening for her too? The rain came harder that evening, drumming against the windows, turning the city lights into streaks of silver and gold, and Elise stood in her tiny kitchen, staring at a pan of pasta she had made too much of, telling herself it was foolish to even think of sharing it, yet her hand shook as she reached for an extra plate. The thought of him just beyond the wall impossible to silence. She remembered the way his damp shirt had clung to his chest. The storm in his eyes and the air in her apartment felt suddenly heavier, as though he were already there. A knock shattered her hesitation, low and firm, and when she opened the door he stood there, taller than the narrow frame could hold, rain still glistening on his hair, his grey eyes scanning her face with an intensity that made her breath falter. He didn't ask permission, only lifted the bottle of wine in his hand, a silent offering, and in that gesture she saw the unspoken truth. He wanted this as much as she did. She stepped aside, pulse racing, letting him in, and suddenly her small living room seemed transformed, charged with heat, the faint scent of his cologne mixing with the steam of her dinner. He removed his coat, his movements slow, deliberate, and when his fingers brushed hers as he passed the bottle, the contact left a trail of fire along her skin. A promise of everything neither dared say aloud. They sat close, too close for strangers, knees brushing under the table, and every glance across the flickering light of a candle carried the weight of a confession. He asked about her work, his voice low, smooth, and though the words were simple, the way his gaze lingered on her lips turned every answer into something far more dangerous. Elise tried to steady her hand as she lifted her glass, but her fingers betrayed her, trembling, and his eyes caught the slip, a shadow of a smile touching his mouth, as if he knew the effect he had on her. The conversation flowed like wine, rich and intoxicating, yet beneath it pulsed the silent rhythm of desire, the air thick with pauses that said more than words. At one moment she reached for the bread, and his hand met hers, strong and warm, neither pulling away, both caught in the charged stillness that stretched between them. Her chest tightened, her breath shallow, the taste of wine still on her tongue, and she knew if she leaned forward even a fraction, the night would change forever. But he was the one who leaned first, his stormy gaze holding hers captive, his hand brushing hers as though testing the boundary between restraint and surrender. And Elise felt her body betray her with a rush of heat, her lips parting in anticipation. The world beyond the walls faded. The rain, the city, everything drowned in the magnetic pull between them, and the silence roared with the unspoken truth that they could not resist each other much longer. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, the sensation of his nearness overwhelming, and when she opened them again, his face was inches from hers, his breath mingling with hers, the heat of his body radiating like fire across the narrow table. It was a moment suspended in time, a cliff of desire where only one step remained, and the question burned in the air between them. Would he claim the kiss they both craved, or leave her trembling in the unbearable tension of longing? One dinner, one look, no way back. The candlelight trembled between them, throwing soft shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw, the storm in his eyes. And Elise felt her chest rise and fall too quickly, each breath shallow, as though the room itself had grown too small for both of them. The silence stretched, and the weight of his gaze pressed into her skin, until she could no longer pretend, no longer hide the truth burning in every flush of her cheeks and every tremor in her hands. He lifted his hand slowly, as if testing the air between them, and when his fingers grazed her cheek, rough with the faint calluses of a man who had lived too much, Elise nearly closed her eyes in surrender. The touch was gentle yet commanding, a contrast that stole her willpower, and she leaned into his palm with a quiet, unspoken confession. She wanted this. She wanted him, their foreheads brushed, a tender collision that sent shivers down her spine, and for a suspended moment she thought he would pull away, retreat back into the armor of distance, but instead his thumb traced the curve of her lips, and her breath escaped in a trembling sigh, the sound filling the silence like a vow. The wine on his breath mixed with the faint scent of rain clinging to his shirt, and she tasted him before their mouths ever met. Then, without hesitation, he closed the distance, and his lips claimed hers in a kiss that was not tentative, not polite but fierce, consuming. A kiss of a man who had waited too long to feel alive again. Elise gasped against his mouth, her fingers clutching at the fabric of his shirt, as if to anchor herself against the flood of heat that crashed through her. Every nerve alive, every thought silenced by the undeniable truth of his desire. The world outside ceased to exist. The storm, the city, even the walls around them fading into nothing, and all that remained was the press of his lips, the taste of wine and temptation. The way his hand slid to the back of her neck, pulling her closer, deeper, as though he could not bear even an inch of distance between them. She melted against him, her body fitting into his as though it had always belonged there, as though the space between their apartments had only ever been a prelude to this inevitable surrender. When at last he pulled back, breathless, his forehead still resting against hers, his stormy eyes searched her face, and Elise saw in them not only hunger but something far more dangerous, a vulnerability he had hidden even from himself. Her lips were swollen, her pulse still racing, and the room felt altered, charged, no longer her sanctuary but the place where her solitude had ended. She whispered his name, though she did not even know it, the sound slipping from her lips like a prayer, and he gave her a faint, almost broken smile, his voice a low murmur brushing against her skin as he said, "You were never meant to stay hidden from me." The words lingered like a promise, like a warning, and Elise knew with absolute certainty that this kiss was not an accident, not a mistake, but the beginning of a passion that would consume them both. His kiss rewrote her rules, and none of them survived. The kiss lingered long after it ended, the taste of wine and heat still on her lips, and Elise sat frozen in the narrow kitchen chair, her pulse beating too fast, her body betraying her with the warmth that spread in waves beneath her skin. He had not stepped back far, his hand still brushing her arm as if unwilling to let go, and the space between them, so small and fragile, felt like a secret world no one else could touch. The flicker of the candlelight caught in his grey eyes, softer now but no less consuming, and Elise felt as if she had been seen in a way she had never been seen before. Her mind whispered that she should pull away, that this was madness, that neighbors were not supposed to blur lines this way, but her body refused to obey, leaning ever so slightly toward the heat of him, as if gravity itself had chosen sides. She tried to steady her breathing, but the more she fought, the more the silence thickened between them, until even the sound of her own heartbeat felt too loud, too revealing. He broke the silence first, his voice low and rough, the kind of tone that slipped beneath her defenses. "This shouldn't have happened," he murmured, but the way his thumb traced the inside of her wrist told another story, a story of a man who had no intention of letting the moment fade. His contradiction set fire to her insides, the clash of his words and his touch a temptation she could not escape. Elise's lips parted, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Then why can't you let go?" The words spilled out before she could stop them, raw and exposed, and his eyes darkened, the storm inside them surging closer, stripping away the last barrier of restraint. She felt his hand slide slowly down her arm, lingering at her elbow, a simple gesture that made her entire body tremble with anticipation. The air in the small room shifted, heavier now, filled with the electric pull of two people, standing at the edge of something forbidden and irresistible. She wanted to tell him to stop, to remind him that this was only supposed to be an apartment, a hiding place, not the stage for a dangerous romance. But when his fingers brushed hers again, interlacing for the briefest second, all reason dissolved, leaving only desire. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her temple, and whispered, "You don't know what you're asking for." But Elise knew, in the rapid beat of her heart, in the way her body burned for him, that she did know, and she wanted it anyway. She turned her face just enough that their eyes met again, and the silence between them was no longer empty. It was a promise waiting to be broken. For a moment that felt endless. Neither moved, caught in the fragile balance of restraint and surrender, and Elise realized that the true danger was not the kiss they had shared, but the certainty that it had only been the beginning. Her quiet sanctuary was gone, and in its place was the fire of a billionaire neighbor whose touch would haunt her until she let herself fall completely. He said it shouldn't happen. His hand said it absolutely would. The storm outside refused to fade, rain sliding down the window like silver threads, and in the hush of her apartment, Elise felt the weight of what had just happened, the kiss still burning on her lips, her body still trembling from the nearness of him. He had not rushed to leave, his tall frame leaning against her counter as though he belonged there, his stormy eyes watching her with a focus so intense it made her skin flush beneath the heat of it. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but charged, alive, a current that neither of them dared sever. He lifted the wineglass again, his fingers brushing hers as he passed it back. And though the gesture was small, the way he looked at her over the rim, slow and deliberate, sent a shiver down her spine. Elise tried to steady her breath, telling herself to remember caution, to remember why she had come here, but his presence blurred every reason until all that remained was the raw pull of desire. She turned slightly, her hair falling over her cheek, but even that failed to shield her from the weight of his gaze. "You cook," he said finally, his voice a low rumble that seemed to fill the tiny kitchen. And though the words were simple, Elise felt them as a caress, a recognition that went deeper than she expected. She gave a nervous laugh, murmuring something about making too much, but he only tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as though he had already decided she belonged in his world. There was no casualness in the way he spoke. Every word was chosen, heavy, intentional. Then, without breaking eye contact, he pushed his empty plate aside and leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his frame closing the distance between them, in a gesture that was not only bold, but undeniably intimate. "Dinner," he murmured, his voice dipping lower, velvet-edged with command. "Next time in my place." It was not a question, not even an invitation. It was a statement, a decision he had already made, and the force of it sent Elise's heart racing. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass, the sound of rain louder now against the windows, as if the world itself demanded her answer. She could tell him no, remind him that they were neighbors, that this was reckless. But when she lifted her gaze to his, the refusal died on her tongue. There was too much heat there, too much unspoken promise, and her body betrayed her with the soft flush of agreement before her lips had even moved. Her silence was enough for him. A faint curve touched his mouth, not a smile exactly, but a shadow of satisfaction, as though he had read her answer in her trembling breath, in the way her pulse fluttered in her throat. He leaned back slightly, giving her space, but Elise knew it was an illusion. Space would never exist between them again, not after this. The boundaries had been crossed, and the lines erased with the taste of a kiss still lingering. She rose to clear the dishes, needing to move, to hide the restless energy vibrating through her. But when she passed behind him, his hand caught her wrist, firm yet gentle, halting her in place. He looked up at her, his stormy eyes softened with something dangerously close to hunger, and his thumb brushed the inside of her wrist in a slow, deliberate stroke that left her breathless. "Don't make me wait too long, Elise," he whispered, her name on his lips like a secret vow, and in that moment she knew she was already lost to him. Dinner at his place, invitation or claim. His apartment was nothing like hers, wide and polished, a space that seemed to carry his strength in every line of steel and glass. Yet when Elise stepped inside, it wasn't the luxury that stole her breath. It was him, standing close behind her, his presence overwhelming, his stormy gaze locked on her, as though she were the only thing that mattered in the vast room. The silence stretched, filled with the hum of the city outside. But within these walls, the air was thick with something else entirely, the unspoken knowledge that tonight would not end as it had before. He poured the wine, the liquid dark and rich, and handed her the glass, his fingers grazing hers with deliberate slowness, a spark that traveled straight through her body. Leaving her lips parted on a breath she could not catch, Elise tried to steady herself to speak, but the words dissolved when he stepped closer, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face, his touch tender yet commanding, a silent claim. She met his eyes, and in them she saw no hesitation, only the burning certainty of a man who had already chosen. Their lips met before another word could be spoken, a kiss deeper, hungrier than the first, the kind that stole her balance. That forced her to clutch at his shirt, as though the ground itself had vanished beneath her feet. His hands framed her face, then slid lower, strong and steady, drawing her against him until every inch of her body felt the heat of his. The taste of him was intoxicating, a mixture of wine and raw desire, and Elise melted into the kiss with a surrender that left no doubt. She was his tonight. He lifted her easily, as though she weighed nothing, carrying her across the room without breaking the kiss, and the way his mouth claimed hers again and again left her breathless, her thoughts spinning, her body alive with a fire she had never known. Thabd welcomed them in a rush of fabric and heat, and Elise found herself beneath him, his stormy gaze burning into hers, his hand tracing her skin with reverence and hunger all at once. Every touch felt like a vow, every kiss like a promise that this night would never be forgotten. She tangled her fingers in his hair, pulling him closer, and when his lips trailed from her mouth to the curve of her neck, she gasped, the sound soft yet desperate, a confession of how completely he had undone her. The world shrank to the rhythm of their breaths, the heat of his body pressed to hers, the weight of his desire crashing over her like a storm she no longer wanted to escape. Elise had come here to hide, to disappear, but tonight she was more alive than she had ever been. His whispers brushed her skin, words she could barely understand, fragments of need and longing spoken against her ear, and she answered not with speech but with touch, with the arch of her body, with the way she held him, as if she had always been waiting for this. The boundaries of caution and restraint had long since vanished, and in their place burned the fierce, unshakable truth of passion finally set free. When at last they collapsed together, tangled in the sheets, their breaths still ragged, his arm pulled her close, holding her as though letting go would be impossible. Elise rested her head against his chest, listening to the heavy rhythm of his heartbeat, and for the first time since she had moved into the small apartment next door, she felt not like a ghost in hiding, but like a woman found, claimed, and cherished in the arms of the billionaire she could no longer resist. Tonight, the line between neighbors disappeared, for good. The first light of dawn crept through the tall windows, soft gold spilling across the room, and Elise stirred beneath the sheets. The warmth of his body still pressed against her back, steady and solid, a reminder that the night had not been a dream. She kept her eyes closed for a moment, savoring the rhythm of his breathing, the weight of his arm draped across her waist, the comfort of belonging she had not felt in so long. For a fleeting heartbeat, she let herself believe this was her place, that she had always belonged here, in the arms of the man who had undone her with a single kiss. When she finally turned, her gaze met his, stormy grey softened by the pale light, and the sight stole her breath. He was already awake, watching her as though she were a secret he was trying to memorize, his expression unreadable yet vulnerable in a way she had never expected. Her cheeks warmed under the intensity of his stare, and she tried to hide behind a smile, but the tenderness in his eyes made her heart stumble. He brushed his thumb along her cheek, slow and deliberate, and whispered her name, as though testing its weight, as though claiming it. The sound made her pulse quicken, and she leaned into his touch, lips parting in a sigh that told him more than words ever could. Yet beneath the sweetness of the moment, Elise felt the shadow of doubt stir, the quiet voice that reminded her this was too sudden, too dangerous, a fire that could not burn forever without consuming them both. She rose from the bed reluctantly, wrapping herself in the sheet, walking toward the window where the city stretched awake below them, its towers glowing in the sunrise. She told herself to keep her distance, to protect the fragile life she had built, but when she felt his arms circle her from behind, his lips brushing her shoulder, her resolve melted once again. His presence was a force, steady and overwhelming, and she found herself leaning back into him, surrendering to the inevitability of his hold. "Stay," he murmured, his voice low against her skin, and the single word carried more weight than she was ready for. It was not just about the morning. It was a command, a promise, a claim that stretched far beyond the walls of this apartment. Her heart raced, torn between the craving to belong and the fear of losing herself, and she closed her ears, torn in two. She turned to face him, searching his expression, trying to read the man behind the stormy gaze, and for the first time she wondered what he was hiding, what pain or past had carved the shadows into his eyes. He was not simply the neighbor next door, not simply the man who had kissed her into surrender. He was a billionaire whose life carried weight and secrets, and she was stepping into a world she did not understand. As he pulled her close once more, Elise's heart pounded with the truth she could notescape. Last night had changed everything. And the morning light had revealed not just tenderness, but the dangerous question that would follow her with every breath. Was she ready to risk her fragile peace for the fire of a love that could consume her? He whispered, "Stay." Could she survive what staying meant? The city gleamed outside the windows, the morning light catching on glass towers and casting the skyline in shades of silver and gold. But Elise could hardly see it, her attention caught by the man who stood beside her, the man whose presence made the entire room feel charged. He moved with a quiet authority, every gesture precise, his tailored shirt clinging to the lines of his body, and though he said nothing at first, the air between them was thick with unspoken meaning. Elise wrapped her arms around herself, trying to anchor against the pull, but the moment his stormy eyes met hers, she felt her defenses crumble. He crossed the room with deliberate steps, closing the distance as though there had never been space between them, and when his hand found hers, firm and warm, Elise felt her pulse leap. Without asking, he led her toward the wide balcony where the city stretched endlessly below, alive and restless. "This is my world," he said softly, his voice rough but steady, a confession that seemed to weigh more than the glittering skyline. "And now you're part of it." Her breath caught, the words pressing into her chest like a brand, and she turned her gaze away, searching the horizon for courage. She wanted to believe him, wanted to step into the promise his voice carried, but deep inside she felt the tremor of doubt, the voice that whispered she didn't belong in the arms of a man whose life was built on power and wealth. Yet when his hand tightened around hers, when his thumb brushed slow circles against her skin, the doubt weakened, burned away by the heat of his touch. He leaned closer, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, his breath warm, and whispered, "Don't look down." "Elise, look at me." She obeyed before she realized it, her eyes locking on his, and what she saw there stole every protest. Beneath the steel of his gaze burned something raw, something unguarded, and it made her ache with the dangerous thought that she was the only one who could see the man behind the billionaire mask. Their lips met again, this time slower, deeper, a kiss that was less fire and more inevitability, as though the universe itself had drawn them to this moment. She melted against him, her body molding to his, her hands finding the fabric of his shirt, clutching him as though he were the only thing holding her steady. The kiss stretched long, heavy with promise, and when it broke, his forehead rested against hers, his breath uneven, his jaw tight with restraint he was quickly losing. "Elise," he murmured, her name breaking from his lips like a vow. "Don't run from this." The plea in his voice struck deeper than any command, and she felt her heart twist, caught between the safety of solitude and the danger of surrender. Her fingers lingered on his chest, tracing the rhythm of his heartbeat, and she wondered if he felt the same fear, the same pull that made resistance impossible. For a long moment they stood in silence, the city roaring below them, but in his arms Elise felt as if they were untouchable, suspended in a world that belonged only to them. And yet, as he drew her closer, holding her as though he had no intention of letting go, a single thought echoed in her restless mind. What would happen when passion was no longer enough to bridge the gap between their two worlds? He showed her the view. She only saw him. The evening fell with a velvet sky scattered in lights, and Elise had not expected him to peer at her door. Yet there he was, standing tall and composed, dressed in a dark suit that clung to him with effortless elegance. His stormy eyes held hers for a long moment before he spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying no question. "Come with me." And though part of her wanted to refuse, to retreat into the safety of her tiny apartment, she found her body moving, her hand sliding into his, pulled by a gravity she could no longer deny. The car that waited downstairs gleamed under the city's glow, sleek and commanding, and as he opened the door for her, Elise felt the weight of stares from strangers who lingered nearby, whispers carried on the night air. She stepped inside hesitantly, the leather cool beneath her palms, the subtle scent of his cologne filling the confined space. And when he slid in beside her, the distance vanished, leaving only the overwhelming awareness of his nearness. The drive was silent, yet alive with tension. Every glance he cast her way a spark, every brush of his sleeve against hers a promise. Elise tried to look out the window, but their reflection kept pulling her back to him, to the strength of his jaw, the way his hand rested confidently on the wheel, the kind of presence that belonged to someone born to command. She swallowed hard, realizing with each passing street that she was stepping into a world far larger than anything she had ever known. When they arrived, the doors of an exclusive restaurant opened, as though the entire place had been waiting for him. The maitre d' bowing slightly, ushering them inside with a respect that left Elise breathless. Crystal lights shimmered overhead, casting rainbows across polished glass, and she felt her breath falter at the opulence. Yet what unsettled her most was not the grandeur, but the way every pair of eyes seemed to follow them. To follow him, and by extension, her. He pulled out her chair, his hand brushing the curve of her back as he did. And even in the glittering room she felt heat climb her skin, the intimacy of the gesture hidden beneath 1,000 polite glances. They spoke little, but each word carried weight, his voice dipping lower when he leaned closer, his stormy eyes never leaving hers. Elise could barely taste the food, her pulse racing with every shift of his gaze, every small brush of his fingers against hers across the linen-draped table. For a moment, she forgot where she was, the room blurring around them, her world narrowing to the way he looked at her, as though she were the only one who existed. Yet in that same gaze she felt the danger, the knowledge that his life was not ordinary, that stepping further into it would strip away the quiet anonymity she had sought. Her heart ached with the contradiction. She longed to belong to him, yet feared being consumed by the fire he carried. When he leaned in, his lips nearly grazing her ear as he whispered, "So you don't have to be afraid." Elise shivered, caught between surrender and escape. The promise in his voice was undeniable, the kind of vow that could change everything. And as she closed her eyes briefly, she realized the truth she had been avoiding since the moment they met. There was no way back. The neighbor next door was no longer just a man. He was the beginning of a love story too powerful to resist. In a room built for power, his gaze chose her. The restaurant glittered with elegance, the chandeliers raining light across polished glass and golden mirrors. But Elise could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, the sharp glances, the subtle whispers, the way eyes lingered on her, as though they had already judged her place at his side. She tried to steady her breath, reminding herself that it was only dinner, only a moment. But the silence of strangers carried more judgment than words ever could, and her chest tightened beneath their gaze. He seemed unaffected, his stormy eyes locked only on her, his presence a shield against the glittering stares. But even his quiet intensity could not erase the truth. Elise was an outsider here, a woman who had rented a small apartment in search of anonymity, now seated beside a man who commanded attention everywhere he went. She sipped her wine to hide the tremor of her hands, but the glass shook slightly, betraying the storm inside her. It was then that a woman approached their table, tall and poised, her gown catching the light like liquid silver. She leaned close to him with the ease of someone who had known him too long, her smile sharp, her voice soft yet edged with steel. "I didn't expect to see you tonight," she said, her eyes sliding briefly to Elise, the glance carrying more meaning than the words themselves. Elise's breath hitched, her pulse stumbling under the weight of the rival's unspoken challenge. He dismissed the woman with a polite nod, his tone calm but firm as he introduced Elise, his hand brushing hers under the table, as if to remind her she was not invisible, not unworthy of being here. But the woman's smile lingered, a curve of lips that promised this was not the end. And as she glided away, Elise felt the chill of uncertainty tighten around her heart. The sparkle of the room dimmed, replaced by the shadow of doubt she could not ignore. Elise lowered her gaze to her plate, the food untouched, and fought to swallow past the lump rising in her throat. She had no claim on him, no right to feel the ache that clawed at her chest, yet the sight of another woman's familiarity with him left her trembling with emotions she could not name. Was she falling too fast, too deeply into the arms of a man whose world she could never truly belong to? He reached across the table, his fingers brushing her hand, steady, grounding, his stormy eyes softening when they met hers. "Ignore it," he said simply, his voice carrying a promise of certainty. But Elise knew ignoring would be impossible, because the rival's smile, the weight of the stares, the crushing realization of their different worlds, all of it had planted a seed of fear that would not fade. As the night stretched on, her heart wavered between the fire of his touch and the cold shadow of doubt, and Elise realized with aching clarity that desire alone would not shield her from the truths waiting in his world. The kiss had been the beginning, the night of passion had been surrender, But now came the question that pulsed with every heartbeat. Could she survive the dangers of loving a billionaire? Or would the very world that bound him tear them apart? Diamonds smiled like knives. Was she meant to glitter or bleed? The ride back was cloaked in silence, the hum of the engine steady beneath the storm inside her chest. And Elise sat with her gaze fixed on the blur of city lights rushing past, telling herself she should feel grateful, honored even, yet all she could feel was the hollow ache, left by the rival's smile and the weight of eyes that had not wanted her there. She tried to sit tall, to mask the tremor of doubt that pressed at her. But the truth flickered across her face like a reflection she could not hide. He watched her quietly, his profile sharp against the shadows, his stormy eyes shifting to her, as though he could read every thought she tried to bury. When his hand reached across the seat to cover hers, the gesture was simple yet powerful, steadying her in a way words could not. "Don't," he said finally, his voice low, rough, breaking through the silence. "Don't let them touch what we have." The certainty in his tone made her pulse quicken, though her heart still wavered. By the time they returned, Elise expected him to withdraw into silence, to let the night fade, but instead he followed her inside, his presence filling her small apartment like a storm that had been invited in. She set her purse down with trembling fingers, searching for composure. But the moment she turned, he was already close, his hand cupping her jaw, his stormy gaze holding her captive. "You belong with me," he murmured, each word deliberate, a vow that burned hotter than the doubts inside her. Her lips parted, a protest trembling on the edge, but the protest died when his mouth claimed hers with a hunger that left no space for fear. The kiss was fierce, consuming, pulling her against him until every inch of her body remembered the fire they had shared, every nerve alive with the truth that she could not fight him, could not fight what burned between them. Her hands gripped his shirt, clinging as though the world outside no longer existed, as though nothing mattered but the man who held her. He pulled back only enough to rest his forehead against hers, his breath unsteady, his jaw tight with the force of his restraint. "They don't matter, Elise, none of them. Only this." His hand slid down to her waist, anchoring her, his touch deliberate, protective, a claim she could not ignore. His voice softened then, but the intensity in his eyes only deepened. "Don't doubt me. Don't doubt what you feel when I hold you." Her heart hammered against her ribs, the battle between fear and desire tearing at her. But as his thumb brushed slow circles on her skin, all resistance melted, leaving only the truth she had been running from. She wanted him, not in fleeting moments, not in stolen kisses, but in every breath, every night, every day that stretched before her. And yet the very thought of surrendering so completely left her trembling with equal parts longing and fear. He kissed her again, slower this time, tender as if sealing the words he had spoken, and when she finally pulled back, her eyes blurred with tears she hadn't realized whether. He brushed them away with his thumb, shaking his head faintly, his stormy eyes fierce with emotion. "No one will take you from me," he whispered, and in that vow Elise felt both the sweetest comfort and the most dangerous promise of all. "You belong with me," he said. Was that comfort or a warning? The afternoon sun slanted through the curtains of her small apartment, filling the room with a golden haze, but Elise hardly noticed the light. She noticed only him, the way his still frame leaned against the doorframe as if he owned not just the space, but every breath she took. Her pulse raced, each beat louder than the city outside, and she told herself to breathe, to stay calm. But her body betrayed her with a tremor she could not hide. He crossed the room in slow, measured steps, his storm-gray eyes never leaving hers. A predator who knew his prey was already lost. The scent of him reached her first, clean and sharp, laced with something darker, a whisper of danger wrapped in desire. Her lips parted on a shaky breath, her fingers curling into the fabric of her dress as if to ground herself, but there was no ground left. There was only him. When his hand lifted, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek, her knees nearly gave way. The touch was feather-light, yet it carried the weight of everything she had been trying to resist. Heat surged through her veins, rising like a tide that would not be stopped. She told herself it was madness, that she should step back. But instead she tilted her face into his palm, chasing the warmth that undid her completely. His mouth was on hers before she could form another thought, the kiss deep and unrelenting, tasting of possession and hunger. The world outside ceased to exist. There was no apartment, no past, no future, only the press of his lips, the scrape of his stubble, the intoxicating taste of him flooding her senses. Her hands found his chest, hard beneath the fabric of his shirt, and she clung to him as though he were the only solid thing left in her spinning universe. He pulled her closer, his arms circling her waist, lifting her against him with effortless strength. Her gasp broke the kiss, but he swallowed the sound with another fiercer own, as if each stolen breath belonged to him. The friction of their bodies ignited something dangerous, something irresistible, and Elise knew she was no longer fighting. She was surrendering. The couch caught them in a tumble of heat and tangled limbs, her laughter breaking free for an instant, before his mouth silenced it with a kiss that left her trembling. Taishan's traced fire along her skin, mapping every inch as though she were a secret he had waited years to discover. Every brush, every touch, was a question and an answer at once, a dialogue of desire spoken without words. When she finally pulled back, her lips swollen, her chest rising with ragged breaths, she saw it in his eyes. Not just desire, but a need that mirrored her own. A need so powerful it felt like destiny. And as he whispered her name low and rough against her ear, Elise knew the truth with aching clarity. She had not just fallen into his arms. She had fallen into the kind of love that could burn a lifetime. Laughter died on her lips, replaced by a kiss that stole the night. The night wrapped itself around them like a velvet curtain, the city humming faintly beyond the window. But Elise felt as though the world had shrunk to the space between his heartbeat and hers. His touch was no longer tentative, no longer cautious. It was the touch of a man who had decided to claim what he desired, and his desire was written in every stroke of his hand along her skin. She melted beneath him, her body arching to meet his with a hunger that surprised her, a need that had been waiting for this very moment to break free. Every kiss deepened, the ache inside her. Every press of his lips against her throat sent sparks racing through her veins until she thought she might combust from the fire he ignited. His voice, low and rough with want, whispered her name like a vow, a prayer, a command all at once. The sound trembled through her chest, making her heart beat faster, making her lips part with a sigh she could not contain. She wanted him closer, wanted the weight of him, the warmth of him, the certainty of his body reminding her she was alive, wanted, chosen. When he lifted her into his arms, carrying her with effortless strength, Elise clung to him, her fingers tangling in his hair, as if letting go would mean losing herself. He laid her gently on the bed, but his gaze burned hotter than any flame. Storm-grey eyes darkened with raw, unrestrained passion. She shivered beneath the intensity, not from fear, but from the overwhelming knowledge that she belonged to him in this moment, completely and irrevocably. The world beyond the bedroom disappeared. The city lights, the whispers of her past, the weight of their differences, all of it dissolved under the rhythm of their bodies moving together in perfect, aching harmony. His hands traced the curves of her body as if memorizing them, as if he were writing a secret only he was allowed to know. Her gasps and soft cries filled the air like music, a melody only they could hear. Time ceased to exist. Minutes, hours, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the way he kissed her like he was drowning and she was the air he needed to survive. The way her heart pounded, as though it would never beat the same again. The way their souls collided in the heat of the night. The billionaire and the woman who had come here to hide were no longer neighbors separated by walls. They were fire and storm, tangled together in a night that belonged only to them. And when the dawn finally crept across the window, painting the room in shades of soft gold, Elise lay curled in his arms, her cheek against his chest, his hand tracing idle patterns on her back. For the first time since she had fled her old life, she felt safe, desired, and entirely herself. She closed her eyes and let the truth settle deep inside her. She hadn't just rented an apartment to hide from the world. She had found the man who would set her free. Dawn found them tangled and changed. The first light of dawn slipped through the curtains, soft and golden, brushing across tangled sheets and bare skin. Elise stirred against his chest, her breath warm, her body still humming with the echoes of the night. For a moment she didn't move, savoring the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear, the way his arm held her close, as though even in sleep he refused to let her go. She should have felt fear, fear of what they had done, fear of what it meant. But all she felt was a delicious ache and the quiet certainty that she had never been so alive. Her fingers traced idle circles across his skin, memorizing the heat of him, the solid weight that made her feel anchored after months of drifting. When he woke, his storm-grey eyes softened instantly, his hand sliding up to cup her cheek. "Stay," he murmured, his voice still rough with sleep but laced with an intimacy that made her pulse stumble. The single word carried more promise than 1,000 declarations, a word she longed to believe yet feared to trust. She smiled faintly, trying to mask the flutter of nerves rising in her chest, but he saw through her. His thumb brushed her lips, his gaze fierce yet tender, and he kissed her again, slow and unhurried, as if sealing the memory of the night into forever. Every touch spoke of possession and devotion, and Elise felt her defenses unraveling all over again. Yet beneath the sweetness lingered a tremor of doubt. She had come here to disappear, to escape, and now she was wrapped in the arms of a man whose world could expose her in an instant. The contrast burned like fire and ice inside her, a question she was not ready to answer. But when his lips pressed to her shoulder, when his breath warmed her skin and his voice whispered her name with a hunger that made her shiver, she chose silence. For this morning there was no past, no fear, no future, only them, and the irresistible pull that bound them tighter than reason. And as sunlight spilled across their bodies, Elise knew with aching clarity that she was falling deeper, faster, into a love that could consume everything she thought she knew. "Stay," he murmured. Could she still pretend she'd leave? The morning stretched lazily, but there was nothing lazy about the way he looked at her, storm-grey eyes tracing her every movement, as if memorizing her all over again. Elise tried to slip from the bed, her body still tingling from the night they had shared, but his arm tightened around her waist, pulling her back into the solid warmth of his chest. His breath grazed her ear low and rough. "Not yet," he whispered, and the command in Histon made her shiver. She turned in his arms, her lips parting as if to protest, but the words died the moment this mouth found hers. The kiss was slow and consuming, a kiss that didn't ask but took, unraveling her with every stroke of his tongue. Her hands pressed against his chest, not to push him away, but to hold on tighter, because the fire he set inside her was almost too much to bear. When he pulled back, his gaze was fierce, protective, filled with a hunger that left her trembling. "Oh, you belong here," he said, his voice a promise and a warning at once. "With me, nothing and no one will take you away from this." She wanted to deny it, to cling to, the independence she had fought so hard to rebuild, but her heart betrayed her with the frantic rhythm pounding in her chest. He rose from the bed with a predator's grace, pulling on his shirt but leaving it unbuttoned, his body a study in raw power and restrained desire. Elise sat up, her eyes tracing him despite herself, every line of his frame a reminder of the man who had turned her world upside down. She hated how much she wanted him, how much she already needed him. He caught her staring and smiled faintly, the kind of smile that both disarmed and destroyed. Crossing the room, he tilted her chin up with a single finger, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Stop fighting what we both know is inevitable," he murmured. The words sank into her skin like fire, and she hated how true they felt. Her lips trembled with the urge to answer, to admit the truth, but he silenced her with another kiss, deeper this time, rougher, leaving her gasping when he finally let her breathe. His forehead rested against hers, and his voice was a vow wrapped in velvet and steel. "You are mine, Elise, and I am not a man who loses what is his." Her breath caught, torn between fear and desire, but when his hand slid down her spine, pulling her into him once more, she knew resistance was already lost. Whatever storm he carried, whatever danger his world might hold, she was already too far gone to walk away. And the terrifying, intoxicating truth was that she no longer wanted to. "Stop fighting what we both know," he breathed. Would she? The day unfolded in fragments of stolen touches and lingering glances, each moment charged with a heat that neither of them tried to resist. In the quiet kitchen of her small apartment, Elise stood at the counter pouring coffee, but the weight of his gaze burned hotter than the steam rising from the cup. She tried to steady her hand, but when his arm slid around her waist and his lips brushed the curve of her neck, the cup trembled, spilling a few dark drops onto the counter. Her breath caught, a soft gasp that made him smile against her skin, his stubble a delicious scrape that left her shivering. "You're trembling," he murmured, his voice low, a mixture of command and promise. Elise wanted to deny it, to keep some barrier between them, but her body betrayed her, leaning back into his strength, surrendering before she had spoken a word. He turned her gently, the mug slipping from her fingers forgotten, as his storm-grey eyes locked on hers. His thumb brushed her lips, slow and deliberate, and before she could draw another breath, his mouth claimed hers with a hunger that consumed her. The kiss was not sweet. It was fierce, raw, demanding, the kind of kiss that left her dizzy, clinging to him as though gravity itself had shifted. Her hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, needing more, needing all of him. He lifted her effortlessly onto the counter, the cool marble shocking against her thighs, but the shock vanished when his body pressed against hers, solid and unyielding. The scent of him, clean soap, rich coffee, and something darker, uniquely him, filled her senses, drowning out the world until nothing remained but his touch. "Do you know what you do to me?" He whispered against her mouth, the words rough, trembling with restraint. Elise shook her head faintly, her lips brushing his as she tried to breathe, but his hands tightened on her hips, his control slipping, his desire too raw to hide. "You undo me, Elise, completely." Her heart thundered, a wild, frantic beat that echoed the truth in his confession. She'd come here to vanish, to disappear into anonymity, and instead she had become the center of a storm, the fire that stripped away the layers of a man who once ruled empires. And as his kisses trailed down her throat, setting her skin aflame, she knew she could no longer pretend to resist him. The counter, the coffee, the world outside, it all ceased to matter. There was only his mouth, his hands, his voice whispering her name like a vow. And when she finally gave in fully, arching into him with a desperate cry, Elise understood with terrifying clarity that she no longer belonged to herself. She belonged to him. "You undo me," he confessed, and she knew she wouldn't stop. The night returned like a promise, the city glowing faintly beyond the window, but Elise could not look at the lights. She could only look at him, at the way his body filled the doorway, his shirt hanging open as if even fabric could not contain him. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow, the ache of longing pulling her toward him with invisible threads she could no longer resist. He crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps, the sound of his shoes against the floor a steady rhythm that matched the frantic pounding of her heart. She tried to move, to speak, but the sheer intensity of his gaze pinned her in place. When his hand slid along her jaw, tilting her face upward, she felt her knees weaken, her body surrendering before her mind could form a single thought. His kiss was fire, a deep, consuming flame that stole every breath and left her clinging to him with desperate need. Her fingers dug into his shoulders, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the storm he unleashed inside her. The taste of him was intoxicating, raw and addictive, and she knew she would crave it for the rest of her life. He lifted her easily, carrying her as though she weighed nothing, and laid her against the soft sheets with a reverence that contradicted the hunger in his eyes. His hands traced the lines of her body, slow at first, as if committing every inch to memory, then faster, fiercer, when her soft gasps broke the silence and filled the room with music only he could play. "Elise," he whispered against her throat, her name rough and urgent, as though it were the only word left in the world. She arched beneath him, her body responding to every touch, every kiss, every whispered vow. The air between them was heavy, thick with heat and longing, until it felt as though even the night itself held its breath to watch. Time dissolved, stretching and folding into the rhythm they created together, their bodies speaking the language of passion with every movement. The billionaire who once seemed untouchable, unreachable, was now undone by her, laid bare in his hunger, his need, his surrender. And Elise, who had come here to hide, now burned in the fire of a love she had never dared to imagine. When it ended, when their bodies finally stilled and their breaths slowed, he pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were the most precious thing he had ever possessed. His lips brushed her hair, his heartbeat thundered beneath her cheek, and his voice came soft and low, a vow wrapped in desire. "You are mine, Elise, not for a night. For as long as I breathe, not for a night," he vowed. "For as long as I breathe." The morning light poured through the wide windows like liquid gold, catching on the tangled sheets, on the soft glow of her skin, on the curve of his shoulders as he leaned over her. Elise's breath trembled, her pulse wild, her body still marked by the fire of the night they had shared. She told herself to speak, to pull away before it was too late. But when his storm-grey eyes locked onto hers, every word, every thought dissolved. He kissed her again, slow and devastating, his mouth claiming hers with a tenderness that burned hotter than the fiercest desire. It was not just hunger now. It was devotion, possession, the raw certainty of a man who had chosen her above everything else. Each stroke of his hand across her body whispered a vow that she was his, that nothing could break the bond forged in their surrender. "Elise," he murmured against her lips, his voice low and rough, "you are the only truth I've left." The confession cut through her like lightning, a shock of tenderness from a man who ruled with fire, and she felt her eyes sting with tears she had not expected. Her heart raced not from fear, but from the terrifying clarity of what had already happened. She was his, completely. He pulled her closer, pressing her against his chest as though he could fuse her into his very soul, and she clung to him with equal desperation. Her body still hummed from the night, but her heart now beat with something deeper, fiercer, more dangerous than desire. This was love, wild and unstoppable, the kind that could ruin them or save them both. The city outside stirred awake, but inside the room there was no world, no time, no distance. There was only them, bound by a passion too strong to be denied. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, her lips trembling against his, and she whispered the truth she'd tried so long to hide. "I'm already yours." His answering smile was slow, devastating, and when he kissed her again, the kiss was final, sealing a fate neither of them could undo. It was the kiss of surrender, the kiss of a love too powerful to ever let go. The world might come knocking, but in that bed, in that moment, Elise and her billionaire neighbor were untouchable. For the first time since she had fled her past, Elise no longer felt like a ghost hiding from the world. She felt alive, burning, claimed, and she knew with aching certainty that there was no turning back, no turning back. Would love save them or set them on fire? For more Billionaire Next Door heat and slow burn that explodes, subscribe now and tell me in the comments, would you surrender to a love like this? Or fight it?